My name's Becca. I'm one of the careers consultants here at Cambridge.
And I'm Jane, another careers consultant here.
And this session is reaching out to international organisations and charities. So part of our International Development and Charities Festival that's happening over the next 2 weeks. And we thought we'd start by asking you just to put in the chat what concerns, questions, any worries that you might have with reaching out, either to individuals or to organisations. And if you would like to share with us, how confident are you feeling? So you can answer one question or both in the chat. And I like this picture. I often use this one for the fish out of water. Some people are natural networkers, and some of us feel a bit more like we're a fish out of water. And Jane, I can't see the chat, so I might ask you to tell me what's coming up.
Yeah, Eunice has said, what do they need and can I offer that? Or do I have that to offer?
Yeah, really good question, I think. Absolutely sort of at the heart of why are you talking to someone?
And we have, Saya has big organisations, must have so many applicants. Who do I contact and why would they want me?
Yeah.
Grace says time plus effort required to reach out to multiple organisations. That's quite key when you're doing your studies as well, having the time to factor into it.
Yeah. And we're going to touch on that point a little bit as well. I think, you know, both within the sector and more broadly, you have those big names everyone's heard of that gets loads and loads of applications where it's hard to stand out. Then we know there are smaller organisations out there you might be interested in contacting, but how do you find them if they're less well known? They're, you know, by definition, probably going to be a little bit more difficult to get hold of.
And that leads on to Nithish's comment as well, not sure how to initiate the conversation. So once you know who to contact, how do you start that initial contact?
That whole process is identifying the right people, knowing what they need and what they want from you, and then how do you make a start with that? Do keep adding things as we go through, and Jane, do keep throwing them in the conversation, but I'll move on because I think this leads us really nicely into what we're covering today.
Yeah, it certainly does. So this session today will provide practical advice about how to proactively contact organisations to support your career planning. So we'll cover the reasons for approaching organisations, individuals, assessing your current networking needs, identifying who can help and where to find them, and how to make contact in a virtual world. So as we've just said, how to start that conversation. You might find it helpful actually to have a pen and paper to hand, just so you can make some notes, but we will send you the slides after the session today. So as Becca said, if you just put any questions in the chat or feel free to unmute your mic as we go, we'll pick up these questions as we go along. And there will be a couple of interactive slides that we'll do via Slido, but we'll let you know when those come up.
Absolutely, and the slides are also available attached to the event. So if you did want to open them and look through as we go through, you can do that as well. Sorry, Jane. That's
okay, great. So if we move on to the next slide. So why reach out to individuals and organisations? Connecting with employers isn't just about getting a job, although it's very helpful for this as well, but it can be really beneficial at any stage of your career planning, or indeed if you're preparing to change careers later on down the line. So for instance, if you're looking for a few ideas, connecting with employers can help you to see what options are out there, what the possibilities are, and what others do to assess which may fit your interests. If you have a few ideas, you might be looking for insights to help you assess whether those career options are a good fit for you and you for them as well, to learn more about sectors or roles of interest and to find work experience to test out ideas. If you have a clear goal, you're likely trying to find employment or relevant experience, but connecting with employers can help you to learn more about a particular role, organisation and sector so that you can market yourself and your motivations effectively. So tailoring applications and really demonstrating your commercial awareness there. Connecting with employers can also give you a clearer understanding of recruitment practices so you know what to expect and how to prepare for and navigate each step in that process. Networking can also help to raise your profile with people who work in the sector or those who may want to hire you. But at any stage, you may be looking for a mentor who can help guide you through your career planning and share experiences or point you in the right direction of other contacts. So connecting with employers can be a really positive way to find a mentor, for instance, in a sector that you're exploring, and just generally getting inspiration and finding more out about that. So I'll hand over to Becca now. She's going to talk a little bit more about the hidden job market side of things.
Thanks, Jane. So these stats, I should say, are broad. So these are not specific to developments and charities, but we are going to come on to that in more detail in a minute. But just to get a sense of how complicated, I guess, the job market is. It's really hard to know how many people kind of get jobs through networking, because often by definition, it's a little bit hidden. They're not necessarily responding to advertised positions. And even within this, where people have answered this pie chart is, how did you get your most recent job? And people have answered the question. It may be that although they've said, well, I got it through an online job board, actually they only knew about that online job board because somebody that they met through networking, through chatting, has recommended it to them. So it can be really helpful, as Jane says, it's lots of different stages to get lots of different information from people, talking to organisations. As part of the internal promotion process, for example, somebody may have been chatting to people in that organisation, another organisation that have given them some information about what's the next big thing you should really be aware of, what's the next challenge that your organisation is facing, that you then can talk about as part of that promotion process. So jobs may not be advertised at all, and that does happen in this sector, but even where they are, it can be helpful to talk to people about jobs, find out more about them. More specifically, within the charities and development sector, there's a couple of factors that make it kind of particularly relevant. Often charities and development organisations are working on tight budgets. Of course, commercial companies might be doing the same as well, as might public sector companies or organisations. But what happens with a lot of charities and development is they're using donated funds, where there's a lot of regulation, a lot of oversight. They may have got a donation from an individual, a corporation, wherever they've got it from, maybe a government, that's been ring-fenced for a particular purpose. Let's say it's building housing in an area as a response to a natural disaster. And that's their funding. That funding doesn't necessarily include advertising and paying for an intern. So they have to be quite careful about how they spend that money. That also means that they can be a bit risk averse with hiring. So if somebody they already know is able to recommend someone, or if they know that somebody has done some work for a similar organisation, that feels like a safer bet for them. So those two things kind of together often mean that, well, they end up using a lot of networking. And though we might think that's something quite corporate, that happens a lot in this kind of third sector space as well. We've already had someone mentioning in the chat about those big organisations, and certainly the large names, they're very, very competitive. So for them, it might well be that getting that recommendation maybe from someone who already works for them helps you to stand out from the crowd a little bit. For smaller organisations, maybe they don't have a really complex HR and recruitment team. They don't have a lot of money to spend on advertising vacancies, so it helps them to get people without that expense. And I should say throughout all of this, we're kind of reflecting how the sector is at the moment. It is hugely problematic, and there's a growing awareness within the sector that when you rely on your networks and people you already know to find new employees, that doesn't help diversity very much. You tend to be hiring similar people to the people who already work with you. And combined with the fact that often voluntary work is a big part of work experience, or unpaid internships, none of these things are really helpful for diversity. Again, you might be more likely to recruit people who are able to volunteer, who are able to take an unpaid internship because perhaps they've got family support and they don't need to pay the bills. So, I want to kind of be quite clear about this. This isn't us saying how great networking will solve all your problems. There are kind of problematic elements to it, But nonetheless, it's important, I think, that you're aware that it is a factor in the sector still, and it's worth then using that to your advantage, I guess. Knowing people and having networks is not going to guarantee you a job by any means. It's not the case of, oh, you know, so-and-so, come in, we've got a job for you. But it can be helpful in hearing about different opportunities and getting perhaps that recommendation that you're somebody who's worthwhile being interested in, that will give you that little bit of a boost through the recruitment process. But of course, you're still going to need to prove that you're very effective. I've got some quotes here from a couple of people working in the sector, some of whom are kind of Cambridge alumni, some of whom aren't. Just to give you a sense of what it looks like here. And I like this one from DevX. DevX is a great site, actually, if you're interested in development, has vacancies and some blogs and useful career information, some of which is free to access, some of which is paid to access, but do have a look through. Kate Warren writes quite a bit about it in her networking article, and it's worth reading the whole thing, but the bits I've kind of pulled out, I like her point here about trying to be quite intentional. You know, this isn't something that happens by accident. Thinking about who is it going to be useful for you to connect with, who is it going to be useful for you to learn about. I'm not going to read all of these out, but you can have a look through the slides yourself as well. Janina, who is going to be speaking on our panel tomorrow, really interesting speaker. She's already got a blog with us, which I think is where this quote is taken from, talking about that difference between the larger organisations and the smaller organisations as well. And Matthew makes this point. It's made by one of our other alumni who's going to appear a bit later on in the slideshow, about, you know, it's not just about finding a job, it's about kind of learning what the industry looks like, getting a little bit of insight into what that organisation does. Okay, so getting prepared, thinking about this process. It's useful for you to reflect on, what do you want to get out of this interaction? Is it that you want to find out about a specific job opportunity? Would you like a recommendation for a vacancy site to look at, or to know who's hiring? You know, are you at that stage, thinking back to the slide that Jane was talking through earlier, where you're really ready to get some work experience? That's a great purpose to be reaching out and talking to people. But you might not be at that stage. It might be that, you know, you're interested broadly in working in, let's say, animal welfare charities, but you're not quite sure what role you might do. You know, you're really driven by that value and that mission, but where would your skills and strengths sit best? What sort of positions could you be looking at? What sort of expertise should you be getting? So you might want to talk to someone about that. You know, what would it be useful skills for me to get? Should I look at fundraising? Should I look at, you know, some specific training? Think about what purpose you have in talking to the person you're reaching out to, or the people you hope to be reaching out to. Within this sector particularly, identifying and articulating your values is going to be really helpful. Do be cautious of those kind of grand statements of, you know, I really want to change the world, I want to make society a better place. Spend some time reflecting and thinking about, what is the impact that you hope to have? Where can you see yourself really making an impact? Where is your passion? Is it a geographic region? Is it a particular cause? Are you really interested in children and education? Are you really interested in human rights? And within that, is there any kind of particular group or demographic that you think are particularly interesting to you, or where you have some personal experience, for example? That's the groundwork, and you start with that before you go out and identify the relevant people and organisations that you might want to talk to. And it's worth talking to both reaching out to individuals and then sort of more broadly the places they work with. I think it's helpful before you start to talk to anyone to put together a bit of a CV if you haven't already. Number one, they might ask for it. You might suddenly find that you're in that position of, oh yeah, we might have an internship for you over the summer. Have you got a CV? Could you send it across? But also I think it's quite helpful for you to just reflect on what your skills and strengths are, what your experiences have been, and you might bring that into the conversation. at some point. So if you've done a little bit of groundwork on that, that's helpful. And similarly, Google yourself, check your online footprint. If, like me, you've got a relatively unusual name, if I put my name in Google, it normally comes back with me and it's quite obvious that that's me. If not, it's useful to pair it with something like your degree subject, maybe a job you've done, maybe even your college or just University of Cambridge, and see what comes up. Maybe nothing, and maybe that's fine. But again, within this sector, if you've retweeted something that the UN has released recently about their sustainability goals, if you've written an article for disability access in universities for a student newspaper, these are the kind of things that might come up and actually give someone a bit of pause to think, well, you're an interesting person. Let's say you've messaged them on LinkedIn, they check who you are and what you've done, and they're like, oh yeah, that's great. She wrote that really interesting article. And they might get back to you because of that. So it's just worth thinking about. And of course, in doing that, if there's anything from your personal social media that comes up in the Google search that you'd rather employers didn't know, now's the time to make that private or get rid of it as well. But it's not just that kind of protective aspect, it's also thinking about how they might view you, and that sort of links back to your values and your mission and what the things that you care about. So let's focus in a little bit more on identifying those people. And again, some of you may already have friends, family connections, and maybe, half a dozen people you can think of off the top of your head who you could reach out to you. But some of you won't have that. But what we all have in common in this workshop is that we've studied here and we have access to the Cambridge Alumni Network. People who've worked at Cambridge, I'll go into a little bit more detail about how you can find them at the moment, who may be working in the third sector in some way, who you could reach out to. Your supervisors and tutors may have contacts in industries, particularly if you're studying something that's a little bit connected already to development, as I know some of you are when you introduce yourself. Your peers, fellow students, don't discount them. What have they heard? What are they doing? I know it's been a little bit tricky these past couple of years where there's not been so many opportunities perhaps to meet in person. But thinking about, just asking the question, talking to people, who do they know? People working in the sector who aren't alumni, and professional bodies. So specifically for this sector, Alumni Career Connect is our alumni networking platform. You can connect with people there. It's relatively new in that we switched over, I think it was about a year ago. And that means there's not as many people on there as on our previous platform. The benefit, however, is that everyone who's on there in the last year has said, yes, I'm really keen to be on here. I'd love to get some questions from current Cambridge students and recent graduates. Please, please carry on keeping me on the platform. Please drop me a message and ask me what's going on. So that's a really useful resource. The opposite, I suppose, in terms of pros and cons is LinkedIn, which has got a huge number. I mean, thousands and thousands of Cambridge alumni. And we have a video that you can watch that shows you how to find them on our YouTube channel. The downside is, of course, they haven't necessarily signed up to LinkedIn to hear from current students, but you'd be surprised how many of them are really happy to reply. Do check your college and faculty. They may have their own alumni networks as well. Lots of them do. Professional bodies, these are a bit more on the charity side, the ones I've listed than the development side, and they're all quite UK specific. If you're looking to work in another country, have a look, put professional bodies for charities or for fundraising or, other kind of keywords like that with the name of your country that you're looking at, see what comes up. But these are some really interesting ones that I know of. Sometimes they have lists of members, which is interesting to kind of bring up different organisations you might not have heard of. Sometimes they run events and talks that you can attend, learn a bit more about the industry. That's always interesting. But you might see a really interesting speaker at one of those events and then decide to reach out to them. I heard you speak at this event last week. Would love to talk to you again. I'm going to slightly go out of order and say there's a ton of vacancy sites on the right-hand side. The top ones are mostly development focused. The bottom ones are more charities focused. And even if you're not applying for jobs yet, again, it can throw up some interesting organisations you might not otherwise consider, or you might not even have heard of, and give you a little bit of a sense of what's going on with them as well. You know, it may be that they're suddenly, you know, advertising for somebody to run a particular project. Well, maybe you're not quite in the position of running that project. They might be looking for someone quite senior, but it's interesting information to know that they're about to focus on that project. That could be a little snippet of information that when you reach out to them, you could say, I've seen you're just doing something on this. I'd love to know more about it. It could be the start of a conversation. I'm going to jump back slightly to the directories because what I'm going to do here is just share my screen and show you how some of these work. So forgive me while I do a little bit of stopping and starting of sharing again. Hopefully it will all work smoothly. I shall keep my fingers crossed for that. Make sure I share the right screen as well, because I've got a couple of different ones open. So this one is Going Global, which I mentioned in the directories. I've shown it here as Handshake. That's because it's a subscription-only site. We've paid your subscription. You don't have to pay. You do have to log in through Handshake so that it knows that you're a Cambridge student or alum and you have the right to kind of access the site. It's not specifically development and charities focused. It's about people wanting to work abroad. But under the career guides, it's got various country guides. I'm literally choosing Argentina because it's the first one alphabetically. And they have this section on non-profits and NGOs. They have this for every country that there's a guide for. I should say they don't have a guide for every country. I have used this a couple of times with students, and unfortunately we found that their country that they're interested in isn't there. But give it a look, give it a go. All sorts of useful things you might click on, you know, careers in non-profits. But this local organisations and resources, again, will throw up perhaps some NGOs, some charities that you may not be aware of. It's not a really comprehensive list. It's not every single one. I think that would be really difficult to do. But it gives you a sense of perhaps broadening that range. A couple more that were on that slide. This one is, sorry, slightly out of order because this is Charity Navigator, which is a US-based site. They have kind of directory of different charities. You can browse them by category. If you know that you're really interested in, just because it's come up again, there's wildlife conservation. You could have a look at those. This one similarly is UK based. So again, you can see if you know you're really interested in social welfare, it will bring up various subcategories and various charities who might be working in that area that you may not have heard of or may not have considered before. This isn't kind of graduate or student focused, it's not careers focused, it's just a list of charities that people might find useful, but it will throw up things that perhaps you haven't considered or may not hear of otherwise. There's also the National Charities Register. The link in the slides there is to the UK one, but many countries will have their own. Often charities have to register, you know, legally to say that they're a charity. And so that's another way to just bring up a list and perhaps pull up some that you may not have heard. And I'm talking charities here, but of course, some of them will also have a development focus as well.
Great, thanks Becca for that. So we'll move on now to the different sort of categories of support that are out there. I think they can sort of broadly be put into 4 categories, although you could put them into more if you really wanted to get very detailed about it. But it's a case of thinking about which ones feel most comfortable for you in terms of when you go to actually approach people. So if you approach someone you don't know, you are effectively cold calling them, and it may be harder to get a response that way. You need some way of demonstrating your credibility and giving them a reason to reply. It may be that you'll find someone who can introduce you or help you get in touch with the right people as your network grows. So you might leave these until a little bit later when you've done a bit more research into that area, or investing some time in researching them so you can be convincing, really. It's always helpful to be specific and strategic. So if you want to kind of break into, for instance, water and sanitation in sub-Saharan Africa, then it's well worth spending some time reaching out to other people in that niche rather than a family friend who volunteers at a homeless charity in Doncaster or somewhere, for instance. Then there are warm leads, more likely to reply, but some people don't have these family and friend connections, as Becca mentioned earlier, and you only contact people you already know well. You could end up duplicating information you already have access to. So actively expand your network, ask people to think of others that they could introduce you to. Connections can come up in all sorts of different ways in life. That family friend in Doncaster, for instance, may volunteer with someone who worked with financing home building projects in Central African Republic, for instance. So they can pop up everywhere. It's kind of thinking laterally about your existing contacts. Warm leads can also be people who have made themselves explicitly available. So they've signed up to a mentoring program or spoken at a careers event, invited listeners to message them. So for instance, our Alumni Career Connect virtual platform. So think about your university connections. Peers from your course, college or society you may be involved in will also have personal connections that may be able to help. It's easy to assume that peers are your competition in a competitive labour market, but if you start to draw upon each other's experiences, you will be stronger and more informed than you could ever be alone, really. So think long term. The longer you stay in touch with peers, the more valuable these connections can become professionally, and you'll start to see how their work might connect with yours, and you can support one another. So one of the most valuable resources is people working in the sectors you're interested in. You'll find Cambridge alumni across all sectors, hundreds of organisations and in many different roles. You may not know them, but you do have a connection. You already have that one thing in common. So may want to start with these semi-warm leads. They're likely to be able to connect you to the right people in the sector for further guidance once they've started you off. And some people also like to start by reaching out to an organisation or a person they're less interested in, so they can have a kind of trial run, if you like, before going to the one that they're most excited by. So it's just thinking about those different groups and which ones you feel most comfortable when contacting first and doing more research about. So then we move on to kind of having a strategy. It's about having that, thinking it through and having that action plan before you start. We've put a link here to Sebastian Manhart's blog, because that's a really good step-by-step guide to using LinkedIn to find contacts, to network in that way. So you might like to have a look at that at some point. But with any of these, it's really important to do your homework. So do that research, really think about the considerations that we've gone over earlier on in the session today, so that you know who's best to contact, why you're wanting to contact them, what you can get from this opportunity. So a good starting point could be that you brainstorm everyone you already know, or you commit to reaching out to a complete stranger or researching organisations, but it's really about doing that homework, preparing your objectives as well. So think about why you're contacting them, what you really want to get from this connection, and how you want to move that forward. And ask questions of yourself. Think about the questions you want to ask the people when you're actually getting in touch with them, and how you want that to move forward and help you in your kind of career planning. So if you want to just take a few minutes now with the pen and paper that we mentioned earlier, if you just want to take a few minutes just to jot down a few ideas of your own starting point, and then it might help you to go from there after the session. I'll just give you a couple of moments to do that. Okay, so hopefully you've had a few moments just to think that through and just jot those down for yourself. If you wanted to share anything in the chat, you're very welcome to, as you said. But hopefully that's just giving you a bit of a framework to start your strategy in terms of how you're going to contact people and move that forward.
Thanks, Jane. And some thoughts. It was really interesting. Someone had said, it's how to start that conversation off, how to have that, send that first email, or even as in-person networking opportunities start to become a little bit more available. What might you say to somebody when you first meet them? While people are thinking, can I ask Jane, did you have a preference?
I quite like to see. I think that would be my preference at the moment.
Can you give us a steer as to why? What was it that kind of captured you?
I think there's a nice personal link there.
Yeah.
They've obviously done some research and clear that it's a kind of a real interest because they're, you know, following on social media and that kind of thing. So that kind of attracted me. We've got something here from Rosie who said, we liked the tactic in B and C of being specific with what you like about the organisation. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. And I think both of them as well have, in fact, all of them to a certain extent have got quite a specific request that they're looking for.
Mm-hmm.
And I sometimes talk about that with people, you know, it can feel like you're being a little bit too specific. Sometimes people are worried about, like, I don't want to seem cheeky. I don't want to seem like I'm asking for one thing only. And I think it's important to be aware of that. But I think you should also be aware of the risks of if you just say, tell me everything about this job, tell me everything about what you do. That's actually quite a hard question to answer for the person who receives that email. Like, what do they say in answer to that? What do you really want to know? So being relatively clear about what it is you're asking for, I think, can actually be quite helpful. They might say no. You know, they might be like, no, I don't want to tell you how I got started with my first internship. But in a sense, they can, at least they're saying no to something specific. And it might be that they're like, oh yeah, that's actually quite an easy thing for me to do. I'd be happy to tell you how I got my first internship before this job, or something like that. Any more in the chat, or anything that people really didn't like? Anything you just thought, no, I definitely wouldn't do that?
We weren't sure for like B, we thought they weren't really like asking for anything. They were just saying like, I would like to continue to follow your work. Like, it's not really, they could just not reply to that because it's not really asking a question.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Because it's, so I suppose that the inherent thing in this is that you're asking for them to agree to be your connection on LinkedIn. So I guess that's a specific request, but it's not a very helpful one, is it? You could just look at their work as it appears in Global Peace Careers or whatever, rather than necessarily connect with them on LinkedIn. Anything else that came out of people's discussions?
We've had something in the chat here from Nithish. I guess asking for an internship or job directly isn't the right way to go forward.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, this one.
It is.
I think it really depends on the organisation, and it depends on you as well and what you feel comfortable with. There are organisations that have that kind of welcome you and will say specifically they welcome you applying speculatively. And we have got a session coming up on speculative applications next week. So good plug for that. Where it's absolutely kind of expected that you might well write to them and say, have you got anything coming up that I might be interested in? So I think there are times when it's appropriate. We've got in our, this is a sneak preview of next week, in our CV guide for PhDs and postdocs, although you may not be a PhD or a postdoc yourself, there's an example there of a successful cover letter that someone wrote to, I think it's the WHO, the World Health Organization, when they said exactly that, like, have you got any upcoming internships or projects I could get involved in? And they actually had a positive response. But I do think it's one to be careful of, especially early on in a relationship. I think, you know, there's two danger signs here for me. One is, well, have you checked if they've got any upcoming internships that you could apply for? If the answer is yes, didn't you look at our website under the careers tab, then that's not going to be viewed necessarily very positively. And if you're writing to someone who's, you know, a Cambridge alum who's just sort of made themselves available to have a chat with you through something like Alumni Career Connect, but doesn't necessarily have the power to decide who gets an internship, that's just going to feel like a sort of unhelpful question, I think.
I guess that goes back, Becca, to the doing your homework, doesn't it? Doing your research and thinking about what's realistic to ask for in terms of what type of organisation you're contacting as well. What are they likely to be able to offer you?
And it might be that actually an initial question would be, you know, do you accept speculative applications? Is that something, you know, if it doesn't say that on their website, sometimes they make it really clear that they do or they don't. But if it doesn't say, that might be a useful question to start with that could lead into this a little bit further down the line.
That's all in the chat for now.
Okay, let's move on. So some opinions from those who have been there before you. This is taken from Alana Shake's blog. I found this one online. I emailed her to say, would she be happy for me to quote it in this session? She sent me a really lovely email saying that would be great. So I mentioned that because if you're interested in the kind of work that Alana does, do go and have a look at her blog, and she seems to be quite responsive to her emails. Her email address is there. It is quite an old one. It's a few years, and I think she has moved on to other work now, but it's got some good stuff in it. And one of the things I pulled out of this blog post particularly is this idea of, that I just mentioned, being specific but not too specific, being clear enough that they know what you're asking for and they get a sense of who you are without being so narrow and so restrictive. And maybe that's what you were referring to with the previous example of, like, I just want to know if you've got an internship. Maybe that's a bit too specific. Maybe you want to keep it broader. Maybe you want to say, I'm interested in these particular issues, and I'd love to get some work experience. Could I have a conversation with you about that? That could be an internship, could be work shadowing, could be that they recommend you, somewhere else, may not even be with their organisation that you could look at for that experience. So I thought it was a nice one to sort of balance the broad and the narrow. Another one that's a few years older, and in fact I could not get hold of Chris Plattman, but his blog is freely available, so I don't feel too bad quoting it here. And my apologies if this one sounds a little bit disheartening with the numbers that he runs, this idea of 50 emails that might only end up with one job at the end of it. I think it's useful to know that going in, because it's so easy to get disheartened if you've sent off 5 emails or LinkedIn messages or whatever it is. And someone mentioned this at the beginning in terms of balancing your time and energy, especially alongside your studies. How much time do you give over to this approach, to trying to reach out to people and network, to use that corporate word again? The likelihood is not everyone is going to reply. Some people will reply, and initially maybe they seem really positive and really keen, but then it trickles away and actually nothing comes of it. Or they may reply and say no thank you. And that is part of this process. And I think it's helpful to know that going in, because otherwise you can sort of feel like, am I getting this wrong, or it's not happening for me? I'd encourage you to think for yourself, how much time do I have to spend on this? And within that, within those kind of limits that aren't going to clash with your studies and that sort of thing. Okay, I'm going to be quite resilient, and I'm going to keep sending out the messages, because it might be 50 emails that only get 2 or 3 responses. In this context, he's talking very specifically about sending out emails kind of asking for work, but I think it's true of other things that you might be interested in as well. I'd say with this as well, it's fine to kind of follow up if you haven't had a response. You might follow up, obviously politely, once, perhaps 10 days, 2 weeks later, and just say, I don't know if you'd had a chance to read my message. I'm still really interested in talking to you. Would love to hear from you. Or it could be that you get back to, in that second message, you maybe send something else, like, don't know if you had a chance to read my previous message. I read this article recently and it made me think of the work that you do. Have you read it? So that there's a little new element there. If they don't reply, then, obviously don't keep badgering people and sending them loads of messages. But it might just be that person's quite busy, or they read your message and thought, oh, we'll get back to them later. I've even heard employers say, sometimes something lands on my desk and I don't have either the time to deal with it or the information to answer that question right now, but I'm not against answering it, a few weeks later when I do have the information, I do have the time. So it can be worth following up, both, in the sort of immediate aftermath, or even potentially, 6 months later or a year later, have another go, particularly if it's an organisation that you're really interested in working with, or a person you really would like to talk to. As long as you keep it polite and kind of reasonable, that option is available to you as well. A couple of Cambridge alumni now specifically. Lena, I know we may have some people on the call who were at the MPhil Polis Careers Day a few weeks ago, and she was a really great speaker there. Again, I contacted her and said, was it okay to use this quote? She was delighted and said, please do, Cambridge students, get in touch with her. So have a look for her on LinkedIn. She had this great phrase, which is, please don't be shy. Have a go. What's the worst that could happen? And she talked very kind of eloquently actually about how, sometimes it's easy to put these things off until you've graduated, until, you've finished your dissertation, until you finish the next round of exams. But it's something that you can kind of start right now and you start having those conversations, even if you're not quite ready to apply for the job yet. And finally, the lovely Sebastian, who was at the same event, and we also quoted his blog earlier. Do go and have a look at it. It's a great kind of step-by-step guide to networking, specifically on LinkedIn, with lots of really tangible suggestions of ways that you might go about that. This really interested me. He was saying, he wishes he'd spent 9/10 of his time while he was studying networking and only 1/10 of the time on applications, that, he was sort of doing more like a 50-50, and actually this would be the balance for him. I think that's fascinating. I might start asking more people what they think the right balance would be of networking and applications. I think it's probably different for everyone, but I thought it was an interesting kind of perspective to share there with you. Network was his mantra. And actually, if you listen to him talk about his career, sort of subsequently, networking has played a really big part in that as well. Again, he's on LinkedIn. I know Lena contacted him when she was a student to have a conversation about career stuff. So there's a couple of people already who you might be interested in talking to. Okay, has anything come up, Jane, in the chat, or anything that you've thought of while I've been talking to pick up on?
Saya has said here, should we be connecting with our supervisors and tutors on LinkedIn? Is that a good thing to do?
Oh, yeah, I think it's a really good question. I personally, I would, if my tutor or my supervisor was on LinkedIn. I think generally, LinkedIn is a networking platform, and most people who are on there with the expectation that they will network with other people. There may well be individual tutors or supervisors who have a profile on there but aren't hugely active. There may even be some, I suppose, who wouldn't connect with a student, but I don't think I've heard of tutors who wouldn't connect with a student. Jane, what's your take on this one?
Yeah, I agree. I think you could always ask them as well, I guess, if you're, if you're in touch with them regularly, you could always just ask them politely if they minded if you connected with them. I think that would be absolutely fine. I think if you're on LinkedIn, you expect to be linked with people, don't you, and connected with people. So I think that's fair enough. But good to ask the question, just to double check, definitely.
I think from the tutor's perspective as well, it's really nice for them to hear what their former students are doing quite often. That's just quite nice as a teacher or a tutor to be like, oh, that's what so-and-so is doing, since, I worked with them or supervised them 3 years ago. But it also can be quite useful to them. You never know, you might find you're getting called back in to do a talk, as some of these alumni were. So it can be a mutually beneficial thing. And I think connecting with people, reaching out is always helpful when there's benefit to both sides. And connect with your fellow students as well, other people on your course.